Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, no matter what time of day you're listening to this. My name is Drew.
I'm Kevin.
And we're the only two reps from Matters of State here to talk to you today about terrorism.
Right.
Specifically, the types of terrorism that exist in the world, and then also what is the difference between terrorism as we understand it and terrorism as it is.
Right.
So we're recording about a week after the attacks in Paris happening. Kevin, what happened there? Just
briefly speaking, there were a group of 7 or 8 terrorists, all of them born in Europe, mostly in Belgium, and became radicalized. Some of them very recently.
Yeah, like a couple weeks.
Some of them within weeks.
Or months, yeah.
Yeah, and others had been involved in ISIS for a longer period of time. And they planned out an attack in Paris, and they attacked a concert hall, cafes, places where normal people are going.
Sporting stadium?
A sporting stadium, exactly, where the president was, and killed 130 people at random.
It's terrible. And I'm sure this is something that you've seen, whenever you're listening to this. I mean, certainly a week out from this event, this has been all over the news. Manhunts, follow-up raids, people questioned, taken into custody, and the discussion has been about, the spread of ISIS, the spread of its potential, the increase in its capabilities to carry out terrorist attacks, and this jihadist group, ISIS, right, has been dominating the news for the last year or more, and is dominating it even more because of the Paris attacks.
Right.
But is this all terrorism is, though? I mean, jihadist terrorism, is this the only type of terrorism that exists?
So
certainly not.
That's really all you hear about, right?
Right.
But there are multiple types of terrorism. Some of them are religiously inspired by some bizarre interpretation of their religion.
Right. Not only supposedly inspired by Islam, but also other types of religion.
Christianity,
right?
Buddhism, all kinds. There's political, so it could be far left, far right. There's also ethnocentric, ethno-nationalist separatist movements, which is actually the largest sponsor.
Maybe some of the most active in terms of attempts.
Which is the most active, yeah.
Incidents, yeah.
The most active in terms of attempts of terrorism, or actually terrorist activities.
Right.
Not the most deadly in the last 10, 15 years, but definitely the most active in Europe and in the U.S.
And there's also sort of political spectrum, I guess for lack of a better word, types of terrorism, right? So you have both extreme right and extreme left-wing terrorist groups,
right?
Which may not necessarily be nationalist in nature,
sure,
or terrorist incidents. So, for example of extreme right-wing, you have people bombing abortion clinics, for example.
Yeah, that's absolutely terrorism,
right? For extreme left-wing, in the 1920s in the United States, there were tons of supposed and sort of half carried out, and I think a few successful anarchist/communist terrorist incidents where people were throwing bombs into buildings and things. And if we were recording this podcast, I think in the 1920s, directly, I don't even know how we would do that, directly onto some sort of wax thing, record through a phonogram graph, whatever. First of all, you guys, at home here would not be listening to it because there'd be no way to distribute it easily to you. And then second of all, we probably would be talking about, let's talk about the other kinds of terrorism that are not anarcho or communist.
Right, because that's
terrorism.
All anybody talked about.
That's all they talked about back
right.
then.
And now, I mean, if we just look at the numbers, let's focus on this a little bit, because the majority of terrorist attacks in the last 15 years, and actually prior to that too, have been ethno-nationalist or separatist.
In the world, or
in Europe and the U.S. But let's talk about that a little bit. Just in light of the attacks in Paris, everyone's focused on Europe right now. There have been a number of ethno-nationalist attacks in the past few decades. There have been 758, I think, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think that's about right.
Yeah, 758 ethno-nationalist attacks between 2009 and 2013. In Europe.
In Europe.
Yeah, which is a huge number. That's the vast majority, and there have been only a handful of religious-inspired attacks.
Right.
Now, granted, the religious ones have been the most deadly by far.
Right.
But it seems like these ethno-nationalist ideologies are inspiring the vast majority of terrorist activities. So, I mean, one of the most deadly ones I can think of recently has been the one in Norway.
Anders Breivik, I think, was
I think that's right.
the guy who did that,
who killed some 75 people, somewhere around there, and he was basically you can go ahead and look those numbers up. So a white supremacist, basically.
Yeah, yeah, and he was attacking.
He attacked a camp
of the Workers' Youth League, a summer camp in
Right.
Norway, which is sort of like the youth camp associated with the left-wing political parties in Norway.
Right.
And so he was trying to controvert that by attacking them. And
Right.
so he's a right-wing terrorist, right?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, there's also some it's ethnically driven as well.
Yeah, and I believe his manifesto, which I remember being quite long, was railing against immigrants.
Right,
and
right.
Norway is too welcoming of the other, essentially, right?
Which is very similar, it sounds, to the shooting in Charleston, which happened fairly recently as
Right,
well.
Dylan Roof, right?
Dylan Roof, exactly, who went into a church and shot up a bunch of people. Do you remember how many people he killed?
9.
And, this was racially motivated. And he had a manifesto as well saying pretty similar things. So terrorism, those are a couple of pretty deadly examples. In the U.S., there have been more deaths related to terrorism that were non-religious. So I think there have been 26, according to a study by the New America.
In the U.S.?
In the U.S., yeah. Is that what I said? That's
Yeah.
what I meant to say.
It is.
Okay. So yeah, there's a think tank in here in Washington called the New America, and we'll put a link to that in our show notes as well. 26 people since 9/11 have been killed due to religious terrorism.
Many of those probably with the Fort Hood shooting. Right?
That was the biggest one, right?
Yeah.
That was the biggest one. That's 26 versus 48 who have been killed by terrorism that was, an ethnocentric one or one of the other categories that we talked about. But there have been, like we mentioned, hundreds in Europe over the last few years that were either ethnically motivated or motivated by some sort of separatist movement.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we can just briefly go over a couple of those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think one of the most diverse spectrums of ethno-nationalist terrorism, at least that we have numbers for, sort of data for, that we looked at before we jumped into this conversation, are in Europe. And of course, I'm sure that many of our listeners will have heard of some of the more famous ones. So
Sure.
ETA, which
the
is
Basques.
a Basque, the Basque Freedom and Homeland, I believe, is what their name stands for, in the Basque language, which is a beautiful language, not related to any other European language. It's an ethnic group that supposedly was inhabiting Europe, in Spain and in France before even the Indo-Europeans migrated in several tens of thousands of years ago. And so, this is an example of sort of a cultural group that has a unique culture and language that they're very proud of, a long history and a long heritage, that feels like their political representation is not reflective of or fair to or appropriate for their situation. And then there's a small radical group of those people that has a certain goal, right? Separation from Spain and France for their own homeland that they will kill people for, right? And so this is sort of a perfect example. And I'm sure many of our listeners, have not, have heard about this group. Another one is the IRA, right?
Sure.
The Irish Republican Army, and all of its various splinter groups.
Right.
Irish terrorists.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. That, they went as far as to shoot, rockets, I think, from man pads, shoulder-mounted rockets into, like, the backyard of number 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister's residence in the UK. It's insane, right? But we've heard of these groups. What about, other smaller groups which have been noted to be more active or perhaps more violent? I think the most violent, noted by the EU authorities within their territory.
About the Corsicans?
The Corsicans.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's pretty similar to the Basques, I think. They've got their own cultural identity. Corsica is, if you don't know, it's a pretty large island in the Mediterranean, and it's absolutely gorgeous. It's a region of France. But they've got their own cultural identity, and there's a movement of separatists who have wanted to separate from France and become their own for quite some time, and they've been pretty violent. They've been committing terrorist attacks. They actually recently laid their arms down a year or two ago.
Mm-hmm.
But prior to that, they were very active and were committing terrorist attacks in Corsica and in mainland France, particularly in the south, for a long time. Again, I should qualify that these attacks, on the whole, have been less deadly than the jihadist attacks we've seen in the last since September 11th. But nonetheless, they've been violent and deadly.
Yeah, and they have been more targeted in nature. I think sort of
right.
This
That's
sort of speaks
true.
to the gray areas, the blur that we're seeing, and like what is a terrorist act versus what is an act of political violence.
Right.
So I mean, at least in the case of this Corsican group, I believe they were called, I think their name translates to English as Corsican Nationalist Liberation Front.
Yeah, something like that.
Why wouldn't it, right?
Yeah.
That seems to be all the words that you can combine to describe an ethno-nationalist terrorist group. But they were throwing bombs at people, they were shooting at people, they were conducting political assassinations. But some of their activities could be probably pretty adequately described as political assassinations.
Yeah, sure. Most of their attacks have been towards either politicians or political institutions.
Yeah.
Right? So I think like police headquarters, towards political institutions, right?
Right.
Symbols of French control over the island.
Right. There's another example too in the U.S., which is not, this is sort of a silly example. This group, the Republic of Texas,
right,
which many of us, had not heard of.
Yeah, I had never heard of before we started talking about this.
Right, and of course, some of you listening may think, well, the more we talk about this, you're probably going to be thinking to yourself, of all the places in the U.S. where this would even be a thing, yeah, that checks out. Texas seems about right. But so there's this group, the Republic of Texas, that they believe that Texas is not a part of the Union. Essentially, Texas is still a sovereign nation, like it used to be. This group has committed some acts of violence. They mostly just send letters, sort of kind of threatening letters to federal government institutions that are within Texas territory. And I don't even think these threats usually amount to violence. I think they usually are just like subpoenaing federal government officials to show up in their whatever their court system is,
right.
which sometimes triggers raids from the federal authorities. But in the late 90s, they did their leader kidnapped a couple.
Right.
I believe one of the members of one of the individuals kidnapped was either injured or killed, and the leader is still in prison for kidnapping, though not for terrorism.
Right.
But this is just another example of this is kind of close to home if you're listening in the U.S. of a group that you may not have heard of, but sort of has these weird political motives and is defined by the government as a terrorist group because of the way that they conduct their activities.
Right. And that's just one example of very many, most of which are still active today. On a smaller scale. Right. So
we have, we're kind of breaking out our types of terrorism here. We've got, religious terrorism, and there's sort of its own large subcategory within that, separate from other religions, of Islamist terrorism. And I think here we should pause and sort of make a distinction between, when we say, what is Islamism? So we have, Islam, the religion. We have Islamic, which is the adjective for that description. This could be describing people or groups that adhere to the religion, the teachings of Islam, and follow its precepts for themselves. You have a whole other category, which is Islamism, which is sort of a mix of politics with religion, in which Islamists believe, and this is a minority of the Islamic world, these Islamists believe that political structures should be defined by adherence to Islamic teachings and practices and imposed on those who do not choose it for themselves. Right. And then you have radical Islamists who are actually willing to commit violence to achieve this. Right. So that's an important distinction to be made. But of the types of religious terrorism, there's Islamist terrorism and then other religious. And then we've talked about ethno-nationalist terrorism.
Right.
We've sort of touched on, left-wing and right-wing extremist terrorism. We also have single-issue groups.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Right? Eco-terrorism.
Yeah, people who are committing terrorism because they have one issue that they are extremely passionate about.
Right. Like this one group, Earth Liberation Front.
Right.
So remember your keywords, liberation and front. Those always have to be somewhere in there.
Of course. Greenpeace also has been...
Greenpeace.
Right.
Yeah.
They've been accused of using terrorist activities in the past for their one issue that they are extremely passionate about.
Right. So, sort of cycling back to the Paris attacks, one of the things that came out of this was one of the narratives that is developing with this is the reaction to the Paris attacks. And we talked about how discrimination against Muslims is on the rise, and this is of course unfortunate. This is a reflection of what we saw after 9/11, and I hope that we find a way to sort of stave this off earlier than we did last time. Right? Yeah. If at all. But another piece of that is, the Western world, and in fact the entire world, had quite an emotive outpouring after Paris. But the Beirut attacks that happened a week before Paris did not elicit the same response. And there are some, particularly in the Muslim world, that are upset about this.
Yeah, of course, naturally.
So what
gives? Either way.
Yeah, I mean, what's the deal with this? Are they wrong?
I think, when you think about it, it feels inherently wrong because these are lives that were, like, innocent lives that were lost either way. And why is a French life worth more than a Lebanese life? Well, it's not. They're all humans. They're all innocent people whose lives were ended for nothing. But if you ask, why are people seeming to focus more on the Paris attacks than Beirut? Honestly, I think the main reason is that people feel more of a sense, or Westerners, I should say, feel more of a sense of affinity towards France. It's the country people watch movies about and dream about going there. People who can afford it often spend vacation there. And, I think when you go to a country as a person who, Drew, you've traveled quite a bit. I've been fortunate enough to travel a bit myself, and probably most of our listeners as well. If you've traveled to another country, I think you know that when you go there, it is no longer in your mind just a squiggle on a map. It becomes a country that you can relate to a little bit. You meet people there. You have an experience. It's an experience and a memory for you, and not just a squiggle on a map. So when something horrible like that happens in a place that you've got a connection to, then it hits you more. Yeah.
It's more visceral.
Yeah, and I'll be honest. That was the case for me when the attacks happened in France. It hurt me more because, as you know, Drew, I've got a connection to France. Lived there for a while. I've got a lot of great memories. And when the attacks in Beirut happened, it hurt me as a human, I think, but I didn't feel that connection, unfortunately, with the country because I've never been there. I think that's one part of it. I think probably also there's the fact that as a Westerner, I think we kind of paint the Middle East with a broad brush as well.
Certainly.
Right? So even though Lebanon has been relatively safe in the last few years.
Safe but not stable. Yeah.
Safe but not stable, right? I think we still have the memory of it being a dangerous place. And also it's kind of, it's wrong, but we Americans tend to lump it together with everything else that's going on in the Middle East, I think.
Yeah.
So when something happens over there, people say, "Oh, well, yeah, it's terrible. Another bombing in the Middle East."
Yeah, it's what we expect and what we don't expect, right? So like what we expect, we sort of just brush over, right? When I read the news, another 50 people dead in that place, those places, right, over there in that region.
Right.
It's sort of like, this is what I expected, and I flip the page, right?
Right.
Something else. It's shameful when you think about it.
Sure it is.
And I'm sure some people may think, how did you just say that? But it is the case. And I have to actively want to learn more about what is happening in these places to sift through, and I realize there is so much of this here.
Right.
I didn't even notice. Maybe I saw the headlines 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 3 years ago, yesterday, about these bombings happening or attacks happening or whatever, but I just glossed over it because my mind said, this is to be expected in that place. But when it's Paris, right, the supposed, the cultural capital of Europe, city of lights, sort of a controlled, civilized bustle with street side seating at cafes and things like that, and there's bombs and bullets spraying. This is sort of an importation of what I expect from the Middle East, or that place in the world, into a place where I don't expect it, and it really pops out at me.
Right.
And that's the great tragedy here, is that there are regions of the world where we expect certain behaviors and certain lack of stability. And when that spills over into places where we expect more stability, it's shocking, right? And it really sort of highlights the fact that this is a problem that is always beneath the surface, right? This is a problem that we all, as humans, are dealing with.
Sure, exactly.
So I guess sort of this begs the question, like, what is terrorism? Like, why do we see there's a variety of reasons for someone to commit a terrorist act, don sort of like the garb of terrorism,
right?
Decide to start trying to achieve your goals or enact your beliefs through this violent mechanism of terrorism.
Right. Yeah.
Who are these people?
Yeah. So
great.
That's an interesting question. It's all kinds of people, it turns out. I think just instinctively, a lot of people will assume that terrorists are the kind of people who have no options in life, who are jobless, poor, depressed maybe, who've got some sort of problems. Oh, their girlfriend broke up with them, or their boyfriend broke up with them, or something like that. And I think that is the case sometimes. But really, it's all over the spectrum, right? You have wealthy people, or at least comfortable people, who have been involved in violent terrorism in the United States and abroad. There was an interesting article in the Washington Post the other day by Henry Farrell, who you know. And
I do know.
Yeah.
We know him.
We know him. I don't know if he knows us, but
probably not anymore.
No, probably not anymore.
He was our professor. Yeah.
But he was citing an article in the European Journal of Sociology.
We'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes. I'll look it up.
Sure.
Where he's talking about the correlation between violent Islamic terrorists and engineers. So it turns out that there is a disproportionate number of engineers who become violent Islamic terrorists. Engineers, yeah. So if you look at people who have committed violent acts of terrorism, of Islamic terrorism, and who have degrees, twice as many of those people have degrees in engineering as do in Islamic studies. And I think it's half of all of them have got degrees in engineering, which is an interesting correlation. And it kind of makes you wonder. Obviously, people aren't scared of the engineer on the plane, but we've heard recently of people who are speaking Arabic on planes and causing all kinds of scares.
Right. A redo of, REDUX, redo of sort of the reaction that happened in the U.S. after 9/11.
Yeah, exactly.
And here it is again.
Exactly the same thing, right? But it's interesting because you look at this correlation, and in the article, which we'll also put up in the show notes, is suggesting that the correlation could be because of the mentality that you develop as an engineer, and also poor job prospects. But it's interesting because if you look at that and you say, okay, well, people aren't scared of engineers, right? Even though a very small minority of them become terrorists, and apparently have an increased propensity to become terrorists. But people do, for some reason, paint Islam with that broad brush.
And this struck me a little bit because I thought, okay, engineering, math, neither of which I can do, obviously, which is why I'm here talking to you people. Instead of calculating things, it's critical thinking, right? It's questioning. One of the reasons that Dr. Farrell sort of put forth in his piece was that it might be that engineering and math sort of, they give you concrete answers, and there's a concrete structure which is not to be deviated from.
Right.
So 2 + 2 is always going to be 4. Like, you really can't argue with that, and you're never going to question, is this right? Right? This is like, I know this is correct, and there's a way to prove it, and there's a way to know it. Right? It's always going to be 4. And so for engineers, there is a right answer. There's a structure, It's highly organized. It makes sense, and it's not to be deviated from.
Right.
Sort of a lot of these practices and tools of the trade. And that sort of thinking also applies to very radical interpretations of really any religion, but, in particular, as we've seen in recent history, that sort of peddled by radical Islamist leaders.
Right.
I think it resonates with that kind of thinking pattern.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, that's a theory, but
right,
there has to be something to explain the correlation because the odds are too unlikely.
Mm-hmm.
So there's got to be something there. I'm not sure what it is, but it's interesting.
Now, we're not saying, just like we weren't saying, all of this group are terrorists unequivocally. We're similarly not saying in any way, shape, or form that engineers are probably terrorists. That wouldn't make any sense.
Well, that's the whole thing is that,
right.
It's a very small minority of engineers or of people of any group that are, that do resort to terrorism.
Right.
But it makes you wonder, it just shows you that correlation is arbitrary, and you can probably find some with others. So when you look at groups of Muslims, and it's hard to label an entire people as terrorists, which I think a lot of people end up doing.
Right.
Maybe like deeper down, whether they say it or not. People who wouldn't consider themselves racist, who get scared on an airplane when they see somebody speaking Arabic.
Right.
It just goes to show you that the correlation is it's so minute that it's arbitrary.
Right. Right. But then I think it also touches on another aspect of this, which is that if you're the kind of person who's going to kill people indiscriminately or even discriminately for whatever your purpose is, you have more in common with, and if you're going to do it in the name of Islam, you have more in common with the radicals of other radically different religions, faiths, ideologies, etc., that are into treating other people with as little respect as you do, than other people who, at least by label, supposedly share your faith and your ideology, who get up in the morning and decide not to just murder tons of people,
right,
or one person. I think if there is a discrimination to be made, if there is a broad brush to be painted on a certain group, it is not to be painted on Muslims or Muslims that are terrorists or anarchists or separatist nationalists or racists or whatever. It's to be painted more broadly on the kinds of people who are unable to work out the contradictions in the way that they feel, the way that they think, when they're confronted with difference through any other means except murder, violence, terror, and destruction. All of those people are in a basket, and they're all off together.
Right.
And the rest
they
of
come
us
from all kinds of backgrounds and all kinds of ideologies.
And the rest of us with our diverse backgrounds, ideologies, and flaws in thinking, as we all have of various degrees and kinds, that don't go kill people, don't try to make other people's lives worse based on arbitrary distinctions or separations of humanity. We have more in common with each other than all of those other people do. So
it's a good place to end.
Yeah, let's end it there. So again, this has been Matters of State. We're running a little light today, so it's just the two of us. Again, I'm Drew.
I'm Kevin.
And you can listen to this episode directly by going to www.mattersofstate.org. All of our episodes are up there. This is episode 10. If you just throw /episode 10 or /episode whatever you want to listen to, it gives you a direct link to that episode. And we'll put the show notes up there as well, including links to interesting articles that we used to inform our discussion today. You can download our podcast directly from iTunes, Matters of State, and you can also follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is different; it's Matters of State. That was definitely on purpose, and we look forward to speaking with you again on our next episode.
The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every teacher measure of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot.